You're listening to the Public Finance Live podcast series, brought to you by the PF editorial team, directly from SITFA's 2025 annual conference in Birmingham, England. You can listen to our full series of episodes on the big issues being discussed at this year's conference by searching PF Live wherever you get your podcasts, or by visiting the podcast section of the Public Finance website.
Good afternoon. I'm Martin Reed at Public Finance Magazine, and I'm your host for this PF Live podcast. This episode is sponsored by Norse Group, Britain's largest local authority trading company, offering care, consultancy and a range of commercial services on behalf of local authorities across the country. Now, our theme today is how might underutilised assets play their part in the local government reorganisation conversation. And to discuss it, I'm joined by Justin Galliford, Chief Executive at Norse. Good afternoon. Hello. And Richard Gawthorpe, Group Business Development Director, also at Norse Group.
Good afternoon.
So I suppose the first thing to ask is, this being the first day at PF Live, what do you make of it so far? Richard?
Thank you for asking. Thoroughly enjoyable. Some great sessions today, from the welcome speech all the way through to a panel session to do with asset optimisation earlier on in the day.
Yes, indeed. I was there for that one. There's a lot going on in that session, a lot to unpack, I thought.
Houston, I think it's been a great day. It's always lovely to come to Birmingham. I think the city's got something very special about it, and a really great agenda. I sat on a session just before lunch on devolution, and I thought the panel were really high caliber. So some really interesting perspectives on the devolution journey itself, a health overlay, which is really important about it as future conversations and where Devo really takes local authorities.
And Richard?
I think also when you look at the programme for the 2 days, bringing in decarbonisation as well, because that seems to have been lost in the last few months, if I can say that.
It's interesting. I've heard some of the sessions where it's not been part of the title. It's been introduced kind of, we ought to have it as part of this conversation. But I understand what you're saying. It feels slightly lesser in the mix than it has been.
Well, it falls nicely into that asset optimization piece, doesn't it? In terms of, how do you move forward in making sure that you've got sustainable revenue? Well, the way you do that is making sure that your building's fit for purpose, not only for its intended use, but also energy optimization and all those other aspects as well.
Yeah, and speaking of fit for purpose, I suppose let's get on with the theme, shall we?
Let's do it.
So we're looking at how the repurposing of local authority buildings might be able to help address the close to 400 billion in assets run by authorities. Which of them are most underutilised? What forms of reuse should we be looking for? Importantly, what kind of fiscal structures would we need to manage the necessarily sustainable and flexible local authority estate that we're looking for in the future? So I suppose the first thing to start with is, what are those underutilised assets? What are we talking about here?
It's really interesting. I think there's, when you consider what local authority estates are typically made up of, we've got corporate estate, commercial estate, and then of course we've got housing. And underutilised is certainly not housing. We know we need more of that.
Yeah.
But I think certainly we've all heard of sort of shopping centres that may have been purchased as a commercial investment proposition at a point in time. And given what we know has happened to a high street, there's underutilisation there. And I also think, many councils would acknowledge that some of their corporate estates underutilised, certainly post-COVID, as we move to a hybrid and a sort of more flexible working model. We've got some lovely, very large buildings which just don't necessarily meet modern requirements.
Is this the time to be talking about it? Is there a maturity around this, that there's a kind of broad acceptance that there is these buildings that need to be repurposed?
I think there is. And this conference lays the foundations, doesn't it, to the fiscal pressures that local government are facing. And, when we talk about those assets, what may be underutilised and maybe low-hanging fruit as well, it's anything from surplus offices through to underutilised health sites. It would be really interesting to bring health into the debate, the NHS estate, but also public buildings, as Justin has just said, and car parks as well. We keep forgetting the car parks, underutilisation of car parks. And so I think there are many great examples in the public estate that can be utilised to provide that fiscal security. But we need to unlock that. And one of the areas of doing it, perhaps, is through planning and planning reform.
Talk to me more. What do you mean specifically?
So, from our perspective, we see the reforms in planning as being more of an economic lever rather than regulatory.
Right.
And so utilising that to unlock those assets and be able to fiscally squeeze as much as possible out of that, whether it's the repurposing, whether it's bringing in other agencies into the fore, and considering the asset portfolio in the round rather than cherry picking maybe individual assets, which there is an argument on a decarbonisation level where we've had public sector decarbonisation schemes and the like, where you'll take one or two assets in a portfolio rather than looking in the round.
Yeah.
I think that's what we need to be doing, is looking at the asset in the round. And it was a conversation that Justin and I had earlier on where we were talking about, so what is your strategy? I don't know, Justin, do you want to just pick up on that one?
Yeah, well, I think it's worth just picking up what Richard said, to consider changing planning from its current premise to an economic lever. That's a paradigm shift. That's huge. No. I think central government's made some nod towards it, but there's a lot to do there. We've talked before on these podcasts about, the evolution of a planning system, and that it's almost over democratized. Everybody has a view, and there are so many statutory consultees. So big shift there from central government if it was to try and drive it to an economic lever. But I think Richard's entirely right. And I think that the point to strategy, it's the fundamental point really about asset. What is your strategy for place? And then how do your assets fit into it? I think all too common, we still see trying to find a strategy for a building or an asset. So you have to take that step back and do that real planning piece, and then consider how your assets complement or not your broader strategy. If you don't do that, you're not going to get things optimized.
Yes, I noticed, and that it also came up in one of the sessions today, the whole concept of play strategy, which is really interesting. That planning's on the side of this.
I think in tandem with it being an economic lever rather than a regulatory, I think another thing that planning can do is de-risk the investment, which will then encourage the private sector to come, whether it's into the city, whether it's into your town, invest, create jobs, create that growth as well. So I think planning can play a really key part in unlocking those underutilised assets that we have.
So what's your perspective on the planning reform thus far that the government is putting out or had put out for consultation? The general direction, the flow, what they're saying obviously has been about becoming more of an economic lever, as you say. Are you comfortable that that's going to continue? Because previous attempts have come up against that democracy we're talking about.
Well, I think it's a good start, but we've got to see if this has really got utility. Of course, what underlies this is government's ambition for a significant home building programme, which is really key. But it's not easy to. So I think, will government have a heart? I really hope they do, because, as we said earlier, economic lever is crucial. At the end of the day, sound use of asset is fundamental. If you want to create economic growth, you need good jobs for people and you need good housing. And that all comes down to attracting the right investment so that people live near where they work in a good environment. And fundamentally, that's what planning should be helping us achieve.
Yes, and it will be very interesting to see how that goes. I mean, over the course of next year, absolutely critical time for the planning. Okay, so let's move on to, you've kind of mentioned, Richard, some of the types of estates, healthcare and the like. Is there one that kind of stands out as the obvious one to address at the moment, or is it too broad a mix?
Again, Justin and I were talking earlier on about asset portfolios, and there's been an awful lot of local authorities purchasing shopping centres, and there's been some horror stories, we know, but then there's been some very successful stories in that regard. But we've got legislation coming down the road that could actually impede and impact ongoing rental for local authorities. So when you look at the landlord needing to get tenants into a shopping centre, but then 2027's coming and the MEES regulations coming in, and you need to have an EPC rating of C or better in 2027. If you haven't got that, potentially you're cutting off that revenue stream that you once had. So whilst that can be a very small part of the bigger picture, it's relevant in terms of protecting revenue.
Are you seeing change as a result of that 2027 deadline? Because these things tend to suddenly become a big deal very close to that deadline. But are you seeing a sense that people are taking that seriously?
So in the consultation, so the government did go out to consultation earlier on this year. That sends a signal to the market that they are keen to progress this piece of legislation. But as you have just said, Martin, that there's always the danger that as it comes close to the legislation being enacted, geopolitical pressures or national pressures force you into a different landscape.
Sure. Well, I think one of the things that's interesting is that coincidentally, that date, of course, meets quite an important part in the LGR journey. So for those authorities that go through reorganisation, there's this, back to my point on strategy, then it's a re-evaluation of, well, as a new authority, what are our key strategies? How do we view place and what do we need to achieve? And that will be different, no doubt, to the strategies that current district councils have. So again, I think it's really important to take that step back and say, what are key things we want to achieve? What assets do we have? And how does that complement or not the things that we want to achieve in our first 3 to 5 years?
Okay, so let's move back to the original question set here. To what extent is the need for new unitary councils to develop strategies for their corporate estates a priority? I mean, you talk about the strategies being important, but where should they sit in the priorities of the people putting these things together? And what's the best model? Is there a kind of template of what is?
So certainly the conversations that we're having across the country, that asset portfolio is quite high on the priority list. And an obvious reason for that is that's a way of generating capital or revenue, isn't it? So, and we're seeing across the country that those maybe in the DPP are looking at their assets, and that then is starting to shape maybe a digital solution, but also the asset strategy, whether it's three-pronged, investment, sweat, or dispose and get a capital receipt. So it seems to be very high up on the agenda, certainly with the DPP authorities at the moment.
Okay. I'd like to ask about the concept of regional urban wealth funds as well as an idea. I know that's been floated recently. I know it was something that came up in another event that you were involved in recently. What do you think the place for these could be?
Well, I think as always, investment's welcome. One thing we know is that the public sector is underfunded there. That's something everyone accepts. I think the key is what does the deal look like for investment? Who do we bring in to help us do that? And what sort of return are they looking for? Because whenever you're bringing any form of investment in, outside of an out-and-out capital contribution of the central government, there's got to be a return for it. So it comes back to, let's be really clear what the strategy is. Let's understand what those investing require from this. Let's be confident we can deliver. And then let's make sure we've got successful waypoints along the way to check where we are and adjust if necessary. Because I think what we have learned from the past is that where it goes wrong is where partners wane because interests differ over time or returns aren't what was expected. So I welcome it without shadow of a doubt. But as always, the devil's in the detail, and it's all about good stakeholder engagement and a strong relationship.
Understand. Okay. So rationalisation, obviously, it's something that's a key part. It's all about resources. If people are actually going to put these strategies together, where they're going to get them from?
So you're right. And putting aside the fiscal challenges and pressures that local government got, another aspect is capacity, capability, and maybe experience. So that's where we see a very large gap in maybe capacity and expertise in local government. And that's where the private sector can come into play and offer that expertise to local government.
Every century, our sessions will begin in 10 minutes in malls 9, 10, 11A and 11B.
We were doing so well.
So that's where the private sector can fill that space and provide that expertise from a both operational but strategic perspective as well.
Okay.
And that's certainly something that Huston's talk to us, and we've been assisting him with, and we envisage quite a lot more tailored assistance for authorities as LGR takes shape. I think some of the big priorities, when you think about new unitaries being formed, they will inherit responsibility for adult social services and SEND. They are assets play an important part in delivering those strategies well. And there's certainly capacity gaps in those areas. We see that everywhere. So yes, some pressure points.
Sure. Speaking of LGR, obviously we've spoken various times over the course of the last few months about this. Where are we now, do you think? We're here, PF Live 2025. We've gone through various changes and adaptations.
Yes.
What's your level of confidence in where we are going with it?
Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that authorities at the moment are putting an incredible amount of effort and resource, much of which is not funded by monies allocated to central government, to deliver credible solutions. I think the biggest challenge from talking to customers that I can see is central government actually is going to have many proposals, because I think there's broad consensus with across authorities and shires. You've not enough just had one option. So I think we're hearing quite a lot of proposals potentially going forward with a number of options in it. And government's challenge will be evaluating very credible options against each other to actually try and get some broad lines on maps that work for local places, given consultation and feedback, and actually work for the broader agenda of LGR and, of course, devolution.
So, yeah, and not forgetting the fact that it's a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reshape government, local government, moving forward. So I, with the rose-tinted glasses, see great opportunity in being able to restructure how we deliver frontline services in the future, benefiting the community through both public and private interactions.
Yes, I was going to get towards that from a Norse perspective. And I know it has been something we've discussed before, but you started to question about being optimistic. You must be enjoying the process of seeing all this up in the air and talking to people about where it might actually settle.
Well, I think it's really great to be in a kind of creative space to talk to people about possibilities. That's certainly enjoyable. However, we also acknowledge how tough it is for our customers trying to work forward credible options in a very complex environment. So yes, intellectually it's kind of enjoyable, but the reality is also really quite hard and quite tough at times for customers. So it's something we're just trying to support people in as best we can in whatever shape that bother.
From a Norse point of view, does that mean more resources from your perspective to get in and talking beat?
Well, yeah,
through people?
Absolutely. I mean, certainly one of the things we've found is that customers are quite keen to talk to us about how we may be able to help with some of what we call frontline strategic delivery. Mm-hmm. So if you think about a new authority and a broad strategic horizon, we're the kind of vertical plugins that can help deliver pockets of solutions, whilst new authorities focus on a safe, compliant and longer kind of end-to-end processes that make it work.
Yeah. We're also seeing, not only from our existing client base, but also from other local authorities, an appetite to actually engage and want to learn what other delivery models are out there, rather than those very traditional ways of either outsource or direct delivery. So we sit in a very interesting space, being able to give that alternative to what was a very traditional either out or in, and they're hungry to understand what benefits there are of alternatives.
Next breakout sessions will be starting in 5 minutes in walls 9, 10, 11A and 11B.
Just so you know, are you staying around for those? Okay, well listen, thank you very much. I think we're coming towards the end of this particular session. Good to see you again, and thanks for turning up, Richard. This has been very enjoyable. If people listening to the podcast want to get hold of Norse, what do they do?
Yeah, they can find us online at norsegroup.co.uk, or indeed they can find us on LinkedIn as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of PF Live.
You've been listening to an episode of our Public Finance Live podcast series, brought to you by the PF editorial team directly from SITFA's 2025 annual conference in Birmingham, England. You can listen to our full series of episodes on the big issues being discussed at this year's conference by searching PF Live wherever you get your podcasts.